Did you know that Republicans and Democrats in elite Washington both hate Ukraine? Here's the story. For the past 30 years, we've seen a clear history of American bipartisan hatred for Ukraine and for the freedom of the Ukrainian people. And let me explain why. In 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing. In this moment of opportunity and possibility, President George H.W. Bush traveled to Kyiv and he gave his famous Chicken Kyiv speech in which he urged Ukrainians to stay with Russia.
And yet freedom is not the same as independence.
Ukrainians have been working to be free. Finally, they had their moment and they did not listen to President George H.W. Bush. And so Ukraine created its independence in 1991. 3 years later, Democrats also tried to curb the freedom potential of the Ukrainian people. President Bill Clinton pushed for Ukraine in 1994 to give up its nuclear weapon.
Ukraine formally renounced nuclear arms by joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Skeptics once claimed that the nuclear threat would actually grow after the Soviet Union dissolved. But because of the wisdom and statesmanship of the leaders who joined me here, the skeptics have been proven wrong.
In return, the United States promised to protect Ukraine forever. So did Russia, by the way. This was called the Budapest Memorandum. And in that room in Budapest where this memorandum was signed was a man called Donald Blinken, who, surprise, surprise, was the father of the current United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. It's all in the family, on the left and the right. Anthony Blinken today has criticized Ukraine for daring to attack Russian military facilities and Russian oil facilities deep within Russia.
We have neither supported nor enabled strikes by Ukraine outside of its territory.
Even though every single day for more than 2 years, Russia has been trying to destroy Ukraine. To his credit, President Clinton later apologized for pushing Ukraine to give up its nukes.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons.
But Clinton and Bush were not the only politicians who pushed Ukraine to side with Moscow or to give up their weapons. In 2005, Democratic Senator Barack Obama, before he was president, and Republican Senator Richard Lugar, in a bipartisan effort, oversaw the dismantling of Ukraine's top weapons. Senators Obama and Lugar actually came to Ukraine personally to oversee the dismantling of some of Ukraine's top weapons. Once again, a bipartisan effort to de-arm a nation that fiercely believed in freedom, not in global elites, but in the freedom of the people. And even as Republicans and Democrats in Washington worked to de-arm Ukraine, Ukrainians insisted on a radical, genuine idea of freedom, the type of freedom emblazoned in their trident, freedom that means volia, the will to be free. This is deeply in their consciousness. And so in 2014, the Ukrainians had their revolution of dignity when they stood in the squares of Kyiv and cities around this country, and they refused to leave until the corrupt, globalist, pro-Putin regime of Viktor Yanukovych fled the country. And even then, in the waning days of that revolution, after the secret police fired upon the protest, Western leaders were urging Ukrainians to cool their jets a bit on freedom. Radoslaw Sikorski, who at the time was Polish foreign minister, and surprise, surprise, once again, he's foreign minister now, urged the leaders of the Maidan protests to negotiate with the Yanukovych government because he said, "You're all gonna die if you don't."
The army, you'll all be dead.
When the people in the Maidan, the main square in Kyiv, heard this, they said, "Hell no, we insist on being free." And several days later, they won. The Yanukovych regime fled to Russia. By the way, do you know who had been advising Viktor Yanukovych? Paul Manafort, who later would become Donald Trump's first campaign advisor. And do you know who else fled Ukraine in the wake of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014? The entire Yanukovych cabinet left the country, including the Minister of Ecology, who was also the CEO of Burisma. And a few weeks after the revolution, in Moscow, he met the CEO of Burisma with a business partner of Hunter Biden, the son of the then sitting Vice President of the United States of America. This was the self-same day that Putin took Crimea from Ukraine. And within a few months, by May of 2014, Burisma, which benefited from Putin taking Crimea, would be paying Joe Biden's son a significant amount of money, even as the Obama-Biden administration did nothing to stop Putin from taking Crimea from Ukraine. So Trump was close to one of the corrupt advisors of Viktor Yanukovych, and Joe Biden's son was being paid by a pal of Yanukovych and a pal of Putin. Trump and Biden both have connections to the very same corrupt pro-Putin regime that the Ukrainian people kicked out of their country in 2014. And now we see the same bipartisan hatred of Ukraine today, here in 2024, in Washington right now. The Republicans, well, at least they're not lying. They say they don't want to support Ukraine. But the White House, while claiming to be with Ukraine for as long as it takes, whatever that means, refuses to send Ukraine the weapons needed for victory. And not only that, just days ago, and I speak to you here in Kyiv, a city that has been heavily pummeled by the Russians in the past 24 hours, even now, At this moment of a horrible increase of intensity by Russia, Lloyd Austin, Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense, in the Congress, chastised Ukraine for daring to have the ingenuity to attack Russian oil facilities.
Certainly, those attacks could have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. And
Congressman Austin Scott, a Republican of Georgia, to his credit, highlighted what he saw as the hypocrisy and the weakness from the White House during congressional testimony from Celeste Wallander, a senior Biden defense official.
When the Ukrainians hit Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, the Biden administration came out and condemned the Ukrainians for hitting Russia's oil and gas infrastructure and suggested that they should not do that again. Can you tell me why, while Russia is attacking Ukrainians' oil and gas and energy sector, why shouldn't the Ukrainians attack the Russian oil and gas and energy sector?
The issue on attacking critical infrastructure is when those are civilian targets.
But the Russians are attacking the oil and gas infrastructure in Ukraine, correct?
Absolutely.
And if you're going to win a war, you can't sit back and take punches and not deliver punches. So why shouldn't the Ukrainians attack the oil and gas infrastructure in Russia? Those oil and gas infrastructures in Russia are owned by the Kremlin, correct? It's not like they're owned by a private corporation that have shareholders and private assets are being destroyed.
They are owned by private Russian citizens who are part of the Putin regime. That is correct.
I mean, it makes sense to me that we should destroy them.
So, amid all of the babble and justifications, we have now a crushing new reality that exposes, once again, the bipartisan hatred from elite Washington for the free people of Ukraine. On April 13th, when Iran sent drones and missiles to Israel, the United States swiftly swung into action, helping Israel shoot down the incoming hellfire. Yes, the USA closed the skies over nuclear-armed Israel, which is quite capable of protecting itself. At the very moment when Iran was sending missiles and drones to Israel, I was in Kyiv, Ukraine, 30 miles from Russia, under attack from Iranian-designed drones that Moscow was sending to Ukraine. But unlike Israel, our skies were not protected. The city of Kyiv, which could very well be protected by Patriot missiles, unprotected by the West. The White House, after 2 years of saying we support you as long as it takes, still refuses to protect the skies of Ukraine, especially away from the capital city of Kyiv, even though it was the self-same United States that, in a bipartisan fashion since the 1990s and in the early 2000s, has worked to disarm Ukraine. The fault of the Ukrainians, in the eyes of Moscow, but also in the eyes of elite Washington, is the same. Ukrainians insist on being free not only of Putinist, czarist tyrants, but also of modern global financial and political elites who seek to profit from their control of the people. Ukrainians refuse to accept that sort of control. Ukrainians are free in their faith, their lifestyle, even in their food. They're not controlled by corporations. They're not controlled by tyrants. I know this. I've been in Ukraine every single moment of this full-scale invasion and throughout the pandemic. Russia seeks to erase from the world this example of how humans can live well together. And Washington is okay to turn a blind eye to the sort of wild, fierce freedom that is also a threat, I think as we well know it in America, to the bipartisan American elite control of we the people. Unlike Americans today, Ukrainians don't eat chemicals and pop pills all the time. They still have their ancient traditions and habits and wisdom, while also being incredibly innovative. For example, I can hop on the Kyiv metro simply by tapping my debit card. Because of all this, Ukraine is an incredible threat to the powerful, who profit by people being divided and unable to stand together in freedom. No wonder elite Republicans and Democrats in Washington, with few noble exceptions, do not praise Ukraine's extraordinary revolution of 2014. They never talk about it. Which, by the way, that revolution was so extraordinary and so powerful for free people that the people of Hong Kong, when they saw that Beijing was trying to take away their freedoms forever, the people of Hong Kong took to the streets in 2019, and they were waving the American flag, the British flag, the Hong Kong flag, and the Ukrainian flag, because those in the most direst of straits can recognize who had the most successful revolution for freedom. That was the Ukrainians. The Hong Kong people knew it. Sadly, Hong Kong has now been lost. And sadly, now Russia is doing everything they can with billions of dollars worth of missiles and drones and bullets every single week to erase this story of freedom. And no wonder elite Washington, from President George H.W. Bush, former director of the CIA, to Senator Richard Lugar, Republican, to then Senator Barack Obama, future president, and everyone in between, has either castigated Ukraine or refused to protect this country while actively working to disarm the free people of Ukraine. Ukraine is not a geopolitical entity. Ukraine is not a regime. It's not about President Zelensky. Ukraine is about the people. If you come here, you'll see it. Washington cannot tolerate free people being armed. This is why we see a bipartisan hatred for the freedom of the Ukrainians.
Joe. Little Joe Lindsley.
Joe Lindsley is quickly becoming an American treasure in broadcasting.